Hello friends, this is Devendra Ragaut, Assistant Professor of English, Central University of Rajasthan. Here I am with an introductory lecture on the nature of literature and its genre classification. However, at the very outset, it must be confessed very honestly that the phenomenon of literature is not naturally divisible. The reason being, most of the forms in which literature is found to occur, they are overlapping, they often interpenetrate, they often intersperse. But for the sake of convenience in study, these forms are to be studied under certain major genres. And these genres will make up the subject matter of our lecture today. Now let us switch over to our first slide. Well, the first thing in a study of literature, when we do the generic classification, the question comes, in what major forms can literature appear and why does it appear in those forms only? So here it is, as it is shown in the slides on your screen, that there are four blocks made with drama on the right upper side, then opposite to it novel and short stories on the left upper side, and just below it essay on the lower side on the left and poetry on the lower side on the right. Now why only this configuration of genre classification of literature, and there is a reason for it. Well, what poetry does, it can do poetry, and by poetry taking its generic meaning, I mean also literature, what all the kinds of literature across space and time has done or can do or is likely to do ever, it can do two things. As you see on the screen, on the slide, there is, in the manner of a plus sign, there are two bars, intersecting bars, there is vertical and the horizontal one. At the top of the vertical one, we have imaginary world. And an imaginary world is something that literature creates, whether it is in the genre of drama or in the genre of a novel. Well, another thing which is at the bottom of the vertical bar, that is expression of emotions and ideas. And with this, we have the two things possibly any kind of literature across time and space can do. First of all, let us take imaginary world that is created either in short stories or novels or in drama or in poetry also. What happens is, imaginary world, when it is created by direct telling it, that happens in novel or a short story when there is a direct teller of the story and the audience, or there is a direct target of that storytelling. But opposite to it, when it happens in the form of movies or drama, it is meant to be acted out, to be witnessed or overheard by the viewers, by the spectators. So here it is in the form of combination of the indirect telling and imaginary world. On the other, along the horizontal plane, we have direct telling. In direct telling, it is narrative form. In indirect telling, when it creates an imaginary world, it is drama or movies. Coming to the lower part of this block, on the lower right side, there is poetry. Poetry which results as a combination of the desire to express, the self-expression of thoughts and emotions and ideas. But it is not directly told. There is no direct teller or narrator of this thing. So, with the combination of indirect telling and the expression, the desire to express thoughts, emotions, and ideas, the result is poetry. Similarly, if we move along a horizontal plane to the left side, we have an essay. Essay can be used for argumentation, can be used for any kind of even personal expression of opinion. But here, the author is always free to make a free expression by telling it directly. So this is how in this specific configuration of these genres, we have novel as a combination of imaginary world created through direct telling, and drama as an imaginary world created through indirect telling, poetry as a result of thought of expression, but it is made indirectly, and an essay, again thought of expression, but it is made directly. Now it is time we move over to our next slide, which will deal with the actual study of poetry and the charm of poetry, the secret of poetry. Because any layman reader of poetry would ask the question, why poetry? It hardly makes any sense to me, hardly seems worthy activity to me. But the thing is that poetry is to be approached in a different way. That is why our first thing to be dealt with is psychology of a study of poetry. Because when you study poetry, you have to apply a different set of skills. And those different set of skills would include the very principles of convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Because generally, human beings being subject to certain structures are taught to think in a particular way when they reach a particular conclusion, that is convergent thinking. When you bring all your ideas to be concluded at one point, that is convergent thinking. But poetry is something else, where we need to learn how to get the convergent way of thinking, where everything is left open-ended, where the thoughts are spread, they are allowed to float into the free space. There are no restrictions of structure. And then next thing is the language of poetry. Again, along the line of convergent and divergent, the meaning is also either denotative, that is the descriptive meaning, and connotative, that has the emotional connotations, associations, the images that it evokes, the emotions that it evokes. And another thing that is very significant about poetry is the artificiality of language, because it is generally not very easy to notice this part of or this aspect of language, that it is artificial. What happens? Only a few sounds come out of our mouths and we make some meaning of those sounds. So in poetry, we get the biggest realization, the deepest realization of the artificiality of poetry, because by using certain sounds in certain sequences, we can produce a particular effect. So it helps us, and the poetry is to be approached in this way only. Now, switching over to the next slide, we have the anatomy of poetry, the mechanics of poetry. Poetry is to be taught and is to be studied at 4 levels, ideally. The first one is phonological, that relates to the sound of the poetry, all the sound effects that poetry can have on the recipients. And secondly, we have the structural aspect of poetry, that is the architectural aspect of poetry, that what it is made up of. As we have architecture of our houses, the poetry is made up of verbal material, that is words. And then semantics is the meaning related part of poetry. And finally, stylistics, what stylistic features are created, what effect is created in poetry. Switching over to the particular aspects one by one, phonological features of poetry, as I said earlier, would include sound properties, and among those, rhyme scheme, alliteration, onomatopoeia, and rhythm. These are the basic things, and there are many other. Moving to the other aspect of poetry, we move to structural features. And among structural features, again, as I said earlier, there are structural words like conjunctions, prepositions, and such other things, content words, which are also called lexical items, and then the grammatical patterns. In a piece of poetry, even the grammatical patterns are going to mean a lot. They are going to make a difference of the shade of meaning. And how those lines of poetry are put, supposing the meaning runs over from one line to the other, that is run-on line, and if it is a stop ending, then the meaning will be over as the line is over. There is synchronization of the physical aspect and the semantic aspect. Now we can switch over to the semantic features of poetry, where connotations would mean a lot, where mood building is done through the help of words. Words are put to particular effect, and they are also the attitude reflective words. Every word has got its soul. It has a power to evoke a particular kind of mood in a person. Then moving over to the next slide, and the last one, which marks the imagery, which is a stylistic feature of poetry, because whatever we know of the world through sensory perceptions. And those perceptions reach us through our 5 senses in the form of sensation. That sensation is turned into perception, then perception leads on to conception. And how this conception becomes important in poetry, that is very interesting. Because whatever we feel through our senses is interpreted in a particular way, is given a different proportion, is a different color altogether when it appears in the form of poetry. And that is the reason why most of you must have felt, when you are reading poetry, you often wonder, however in secret, that how does the poet know how I feel, how things happen even in my secret hours. So this imagery is the sensory perception received through visuals, through auditory senses, through gustatory, olfactory, tactile, and kinesthetic. The last one needs some elaboration. Kinesthetic is the physical feel of what is happening, and like words like glide, slide. When you feel like as if you're falling, that very sense is created in you, and that is what poetry is capable of. Well, thank you very much for this, for viewing this.